The cardboard box sat heavy in Tom's hands as he stood at the end of the gravel driveway. The old Victorian house loomed before him, its faded blue paint peeling at the edges, the front porch sagging slightly to the left, exactly as he remembered it, yet somehow smaller. He was 43 now, but the last time he'd walked through that front door, he'd been 28, young and angry and certain he'd never return. "You can do this," he whispered to himself, shifting the box of his remaining possessions from his father's apartment to his other arm. The funeral had been 3 days ago. Small, quiet, attended by people Tom barely recognized, his father's neighbors, a few colleagues from the high school where he'd taught history for 30 years, some distant relatives who seemed to know more about the old man than Tom did. 15 years was a long time to stay away. The key felt foreign in his hand, though it was the same one he'd used growing up. The lock clicked open, and the familiar smell hit him immediately. Old books, wood polish, and something else he couldn't quite name but that his brain instantly recognized as home. It wasn't a pleasant feeling. "Hell of a thing," he muttered, setting the box down in the entryway. His father had moved into an assisted living facility 6 months ago when his Parkinson's had worsened, but he'd kept the house. "Too many memories," he'd said during one of their brief, awkward phone calls. "Can't let it go yet." Now Tom understood that his father had been holding on to the house for him, knowing he wouldn't have anywhere else to go when the time came to settle the estate. The house was surprisingly clean, though dusty. Picture frames lined the hallway. Tom as a baby, as a little boy with a fishing rod, as a teenager in a graduation cap. His mother, beautiful and smiling, in photos that stopped when Tom was 16, the year breast cancer took her. The gap in the photos between then and now felt like a physical space, a void that couldn't be filled. Tom wandered through the first floor, trying to ignore the tightness in his chest, the living room with its old plaid couch, the kitchen with the same ancient refrigerator humming in the corner, his father's study, books still arranged by subject and author, the desk cleared except for a single notepad with a to-do list in his father's once precise handwriting, now shaky from the disease. Call Tom about the house, finish grading finals. Ask about veterans' benefits. Tom ran his fingers along the spines of the books. History mostly. Civil War, World War II, Cold War politics. His father always the teacher. Always distant, always in his head, always with a book or a stack of papers to grade. After Mom died, that distance had grown into a canyon. 2 men living in the same house who couldn't find the words to cross the space between them. By evening, Tom had made it through most of the downstairs, opening windows to let out the stale air, making notes on what would need to be repaired before he could put the house on the market. The real estate agent was coming next week, and there was still so much to sort through. In the kitchen, he found a bottle of his father's whiskey in a cabinet above the fridge. "Sorry, Dad," he said to the empty room, pouring himself a generous glass. "I think we both need this tonight." Upstairs, his old bedroom remained unchanged, a museum to his teenage self. Sports trophies, dog-eared paperbacks, posters of bands he'd forgotten he'd loved. His father hadn't touched it, hadn't converted it to a guest room or an office. It had just waited for 15 years gathering dust. His father's bedroom was harder. The bed was made with hospital corners, military precise as always. The closet still held his clothes, pressed shirts and slacks, the shoes lined up perfectly. On the dresser, a single photo of Tom's mother on their wedding day. Nothing else personal. No clutter, no mess. Just like the man himself, orderly, contained. Everything tucked away where it belonged. Tom sat on the edge of the bed, whiskey in hand, and tried to reconcile this space with the frail old man he'd visited in the care facility. "I didn't know you at all, did I?" he said aloud. It was in the bedside table drawer that he found the first hint something was off. A stack of old photographs he'd never seen before. His father as a young man, standing with a group of serious-looking people in front of what looked like a government building. Another of his father in a room filled with radio equipment. Several more of strangers, men in suits, women with dated hairstyles, all looking formal and somewhat uncomfortable. At the bottom of the stack was a family photo Tom recognized. Himself at about 10 years old, his mother and father on either side of him, standing in front of this very house. They were all smiling, though Tom remembered the argument that had happened just before the timer went off on the camera. Something about his father working too much, missing dinner again. His mother's tight smile made sense now. When he turned the photo over, he noticed something taped to the back. A small brass key, Old-fashioned and ornate, unlike any of the keys to the doors or cabinets in the house. Written in his father's hand next to it in faded blue ink, "When the time comes." Tom stared at the key, turning it over in his palm. It was heavy for its size, probably solid brass with an intricate pattern on the bow, and a short stubby bit with surprisingly complex cuts. Not a modern key at all, something older, something special. He placed it in his pocket, feeling its weight against his leg as he continued sorting through his father's things. By midnight, his eyes were burning from dust and unshed tears, his back aching from bending over boxes and drawers. He'd filled 3 trash bags and started a small pile of items to keep. So little to show for a life. In the hallway, Tom paused at a family portrait he'd always hated, taken just months after his mother died, when his father had insisted they needed to document that we were continuing on. In the photo, 16-year-old Tom looked angry, hollow-eyed. His father looked tired but composed, his hand on Tom's shoulder in a gesture that had felt performative rather than comforting. "Why were you like that?" Tom asked the image of his father. "Why couldn't you just talk to me after she died? Why did you just disappear into yourself?" The house creaked in response, the old timbers settling. Tom had forgotten that sound, how the place seemed to speak at night. His mother used to say it was just the house telling its stories. After she died, those same creaks had seemed ominous to teenage Tom, like the house was keeping secrets. In the morning, Tom woke stiff and disoriented on the living room couch. He hadn't meant to fall asleep there, but exhaustion had caught up with him. The whiskey bottle on the coffee table was significantly emptier than it had been. As he made coffee in the kitchen, using the same old percolator his father had always used, Tom found himself thinking about the key. He fished it out of his jeans pocket where it had left an impression on his thigh while he slept. "What were you hiding, Dad?" he wondered aloud. The key looked like it might fit an antique cabinet or maybe a safety deposit box. Though his father's lawyer hadn't mentioned one, something about it made Tom uneasy. The secrecy, the cryptic note, all his life. He'd thought his father was just an ordinary man, a quiet high school history teacher who liked routine and order, who retreated into books and silence after losing his wife, a man who didn't know how to connect with his son, who let work become his whole world, boring, predictable, emotionally unavailable. But as Tom moved through the house that day, he began noticing things he'd overlooked as a teenager. The books in his father's study weren't just standard history texts. Many focused on Cold War espionage, the Soviet bloc, covert operations. There was an entire shelf devoted to radio communications, engineering manuals from the 1970s, notebooks filled with what looked like technical diagrams. In the basement, behind boxes of Christmas decorations, Tom found a locked metal cabinet he didn't remember. The brass key didn't fit its more modern lock. The garage held more surprises, boxes labeled with years and locations that meant nothing to Tom. Budapest 78, Prague 82, Berlin 85. By evening, the key in Tom's pocket felt heavier, more insistent. There was something in this house his father had wanted him to find. Something important enough to leave a clue, but not important enough to simply tell him about before he died. Or perhaps something too complicated to explain in the sterile confines of a care facility room, with nurses coming and going and his father's mind growing cloudy from medication and disease. As the sun set, Tom stood in the center of his father's study, looking at the walls lined with bookshelves, the heavy oak desk, the reading lamp that cast a small circle of light in the growing darkness. 15 years of anger and distance, and now all he had were questions that would never be answered. Or would they? The key pressed against his leg, a constant reminder. His father, the history teacher, the quiet, orderly man who'd raised him after his mother died. Who had he really been? And what had he left behind that could only be unlocked when he was gone? Tom sat in his father's desk chair, the leather creaking beneath him, and placed the brass key on the blotter. Tomorrow the real work would begin. Measuring rooms for the real estate listing, clearing out furniture, preparing the house to become someone else's home. But tonight, in the quiet of the study with just a circle of lamplight and the weight of memory, Tom knew he wasn't leaving until he discovered exactly what his father had been hiding all these years. Morning light spilled through the dusty blinds of the study where Tom had fallen asleep in his father's chair. His neck ached from the awkward position, and the brass key still sat on the desk where he'd left it. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the strange dreams that had haunted him. Dreams of his father whispering in languages Tom didn't understand. Of doors that kept multiplying down endless hallways. The real estate agent would arrive tomorrow, and Tom had promised to have measurements of all the rooms ready. He'd been putting it off, not wanting to think about strangers walking through these rooms, judging the peeling wallpaper and outdated fixtures, seeing only a fixer-upper opportunity, rather than the place where his life had taken shape. After a quick shower and a breakfast of stale cereal he'd found in the pantry, Tom dug through his father's desk drawers until he found an old measuring tape. Room by room, he recorded dimensions on a notepad, trying to stay focused on the task rather than the memories each space triggered. In his old bedroom, the corner where he'd hidden comic books his father thought were a waste of time. In the upstairs bathroom, the tile he'd cracked playing catch indoors when he was 10, and the stern lecture that followed. In the kitchen, the chair his mother always sat in, the one his father left empty after she died. By mid-afternoon, Tom had finished most of the upstairs and was working through the main floor. The living room, dining room, and kitchen were straightforward. His father's study took longer, with its wall-to-wall bookshelves requiring several measurements. It was while measuring the exterior wall of the study that Tom noticed something odd. According to his measurements, the interior space was nearly 3 feet shorter than it should be, based on the outside dimensions of the house. He checked his numbers twice, then walked around to the outside of the house to measure again. "That can't be right," he muttered, standing in the backyard and staring up at the wall of the study. The house was a perfect rectangle from the outside, but his interior measurements suggested otherwise. There was space unaccounted for, a gap between the study and the exterior wall. Back inside, Tom examined the study more carefully. The wall in question was covered with bookshelves, each one packed tightly with volumes on history and politics. He ran his hands along the edges of the shelves, looking for anything unusual, any hint of a hidden door like in the mystery novels he'd devoured as a kid. Nothing seemed out of place, just shelves, books, and the faint smell of his father's pipe tobacco that still lingered after all these years. Tom sat at the desk again, frustrated, the brass key catching his eye. "When the time comes," his father had written. The time for what? On a hunch, Tom began pulling books from the shelves, looking behind them, checking for hidden switches or compartments. Hours passed as he worked methodically through each shelf. By evening, half the books lay in stacks on the floor, and Tom was sweaty and covered in dust with nothing to show for his efforts. He grabbed the whiskey bottle from the kitchen and poured himself another glass, staring at the wall of shelves with growing irritation. "What were you hiding, Dad?" he asked aloud. "And why make it so damn difficult to find?" The house creaked in response, an almost mocking sound. Tom's gaze drifted to the wood paneling that ran along the lower half of the study walls. It was dark oak, matching the desk and bookshelves installed by his grandfather decades ago according to family lore. Setting his glass down, Tom knelt and examined the paneling more closely. He'd always assumed it was purely decorative, but now he wondered if there might be more to it. He rapped his knuckles against it, listening for any difference in sound that might indicate a hollow space beyond. The first few sections sounded solid, but as he moved toward the corner where the study met the exterior wall, the sound changed, ever so slightly, but enough that Tom noticed. He tapped again, more deliberately this time. Yes, there was definitely something different about this section. Tom's heart raced as his fingers probed the edges of the paneling, feeling for any irregularity. Near the floor, he found it, a small, almost imperceptible gap. Following it upward, he traced what seemed to be the outline of a door, about 3 feet wide and 6 feet tall, perfectly disguised within the pattern of the wood. "Clever, old man," Tom whispered, a mix of frustration and grudging admiration in his voice. "Really clever, but there was no handle, no visible way to open it." Tom sat back on his heels thinking. The key, it had to be connected. But where was the keyhole? Taking a flashlight from his father's desk drawer, Tom examined every inch of the paneling around the hidden door. Nothing obvious stood out. He ran his fingers along the decorative molding that bordered the section, feeling for anything unusual. There, at eye level, what appeared to be a knot in the wood. Looking closer with the flashlight, Tom could see it wasn't a natural knot at all, but a small, circular piece inset into the panel. He pressed it gently and it moved slightly, revealing a keyhole beneath. With shaking hands, Tom took the brass key from the desk. It fit perfectly into the hidden lock. He hesitated, suddenly unsure. Whatever his father had hidden here, he'd gone to extraordinary lengths to keep it secret. Did Tom really want to know? The thought of selling the house without discovering its secrets decided him. He couldn't leave without knowing. Taking a deep breath, Tom turned the key. There was a soft click, followed by the sound of old mechanisms turning within the wall. The panel shifted slightly, and when Tom pushed against it, it swung inward, revealing darkness beyond. The flashlight beam cut through the blackness, illuminating a narrow staircase leading upward into a space between walls. Dust motes danced in the light, disturbed for the first time in what must have been years. Holy hell, Tom breathed, staring at the hidden passageway. Cautiously, he stepped through the doorway and onto the first stair. The air was stale but not unpleasant, slightly metallic with the same faint trace of pipe tobacco that permeated his father's study. The stairs were solid beneath his feet, built with the same care as the rest of the house. Tom ascended slowly, keeping one hand on the wall for balance. The staircase turned at a right angle about halfway up, following the corner of the house. At the top was another door, simpler than the first, just a wooden panel with a basic handle. He hesitated again before turning the handle, his mind racing with possibilities. What would he find? Government secrets? Stolen money? Something shameful his father had hidden away? The door opened with a creak of disused hinges, and Tom directed his flashlight beam into the space beyond. It was a small room, no more than 10 by 12 feet, tucked into what must be space beneath the eaves of the roof. The ceiling sloped down on one side, and a single window, covered from the outside with what looked like false shutters, let in thin lines of evening light through the slats. Unlike the dusty staircase, the room itself was clean and ordered, as if someone had prepared it for a long absence. The walls were lined with shelves containing books, folders, and notebooks. A desk sat beneath the window, with an old-fashioned radio set on top of it, dial switches, and meters that meant nothing to Tom. Next to it was an old typewriter, a sheet of paper still rolled into it. Against another wall stood a filing cabinet and a narrow cot, nearly made with military precision. Above the cot hung a map of Eastern Europe dotted with colored pins. On a small bedside table sat a framed photo that made Tom's breath catch. His mother, much younger than he remembered her, standing next to his father in front of what looked like a government building, both of them smiling widely. Tom stepped fully into the room, overwhelmed. This wasn't just a hiding place, it was a workspace, a second study, a secret life his father had kept hidden literally within the walls of their home. He set the flashlight on the desk, so its beam illuminated the room, and began examining things more closely. The books were mostly in languages he didn't recognize: Russian, Polish, what might be Czech or Hungarian. The notebooks contained his father's handwriting, but again, mostly in foreign languages, with diagrams of what looked like radio frequencies and transmission patterns. The typewriter paper contained a half-finished letter: Sparrow, transmission received. We'll verify through usual channels. If confirmed, this could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for. The mention of troop movements near the border is concerning, especially given recent diplomatic tensions. Regarding your request for extraction, I've forwarded the details to our mutual friends. Preparations are underway, but timeline remains uncertain. Suggest you maintain normal patterns until you hear. The letter ended mid-sentence, as if his father had been interrupted and never returned to finish it. Tom sank into the desk chair, trying to process what he was seeing. His father, the quiet history teacher who'd gone to school each day with his battered briefcase and thermos of coffee, who'd graded papers at the kitchen table every night, who'd seemed so ordinary, so predictable, had been leading a double life all along. The radio equipment, the foreign books, the cryptic letter, it all pointed to something out of a spy novel. Had his father been some kind of intelligence agent? A government operative working from this secret room in their family home? Tom remembered the distant look in his father's eyes sometimes, the late nights when he'd claimed to be working on lesson plans, the occasional unexplained weekends away for teacher conferences. Had it all been a cover? As the last light faded outside the hidden window, Tom remained in the secret room, surrounded by the evidence of a father he'd never truly known, wondering what other secrets the house and his father's past might still be hiding. Tom barely slept that night. his mind racing with questions about the hidden room and what it meant. He'd spent hours examining its contents before exhaustion forced him back downstairs to collapse on the living room couch, the brass key clutched in his hand like a talisman. Dawn found him back in the secret room, this time with coffee and a determination to understand what he'd discovered. The real estate agent was due at noon, but Tom had already decided to postpone the meeting. This was more important than selling the house. This was about understanding who his father really was. In daylight, with the thin streams of sun filtering through the false shutters, the room revealed more details. The radio equipment was sophisticated but clearly dated, 1970s technology, with handwritten labels on some of the dials in his father's precise script. The filing cabinet was locked, but Tom found a small key taped under the desk drawer. Inside the cabinet were folders organized by year, starting in 1972 and ending in 1989, the year Tom turned 17, the year before he left for college. Each contained what appeared to be transmission logs, notes in code, and occasional photographs. Many of the photos showed buildings or street scenes from foreign cities, with handwritten notes on the back noting dates, times, and cryptic comments like package delivered or contact established. Tom's hands trembled slightly as he opened the most worn folder, labeled simply Sparrow. Inside were dozens of typed transcripts of radio transmissions, all following the same format: date, time, frequency, and then exchanges between Blackbird and Sparrow, his father and someone else, using bird-themed code names. "This is crazy," Tom muttered, setting the folder aside and turning to the bookshelf. Among the foreign language books were several personal journals, leather-bound and filled with his father's handwriting. Unlike the coded notes in the folders, these were in plain English, his father's private thoughts, spanning decades. Tom hesitated before opening the earliest one, dated 1971. It felt invasive reading his father's private journals, but the man had been gone for days now, and these journals might be the only way to understand what he'd discovered. The first entry was dated June 14, 1971. "They approached me today after the faculty meeting. Two men in suits who knew everything about me, my military service record, my language skills, my teaching position. They said they need people like me, civilians with the right background who can help without drawing attention, people who believe in protecting our way of life." I said I'd think about it. Helen doesn't know yet. I don't know how to tell her that our government wants to use our home as a listening post, that they want me to monitor radio transmissions and make contact with assets on the other side of the Iron Curtain. It sounds like something from a novel, not something that happens to high school history teachers in small towns. Tom read entry after entry, watching his father's initial hesitation transform into cautious agreement, then into commitment to what he clearly viewed as vital work. According to the journal, his father had been recruited by intelligence services to act as a civilian handler for sources in Eastern Europe, using his background in languages, something Tom hadn't even known about his father, and his inconspicuous position as a teacher to operate beneath the radar. The journal from 1975, the year Tom was born, was particularly revealing. "Thomas William arrived today, 7:06. Helen is exhausted but radiant. I look at my son and wonder what kind of world he'll grow up in. Will the Cold War still be raging when he's my age? Will these silent battles we're fighting now help ensure he lives in a world with a little more freedom, a little less fear? From the agency says I can take 2 weeks off from monitoring, but after that, they need me back at the radio. 3 news sources have come online in Prague, and tensions are high. I didn't tell him that the equipment is 10 feet above my newborn son's room, or that I worry about what would happen to my family if the wrong people ever discovered what I'm doing in this house." Tom sat back, running his hand through his hair. He'd been so wrong about his father, so completely, utterly wrong. The man he'd resented for being distant, for burying himself in work after his mother died, had been carrying an enormous weight all those years. The teacher conferences and late nights had been cover for something far more significant. Another journal from 1981 made Tom's chest tighten. The Bulgarian operation went sideways. "We lost 2 sources and there's concern about how they were compromised. Security protocols are being tightened. No more direct mentions of names or locations in any communications. I'm to destroy all written records of the Prague network and rely only on memory from now on. Helen is asking more questions. She knows something isn't right with the amount of time I'm spending in my study, especially after midnight. I hate lying to her. Sometimes I think she believes I'm having an affair, which is almost easier to let her believe than tell her the truth. The irony is that I'm doing this partly for her family still in Hungary, for the world I want her to be able to live in. Tom flipped ahead, searching for entries around the time of his mother's death. He found the journal from 1988, its pages wrinkled in places as if water had been spilled on them. Or tears. Helen is gone. Cancer. So quick, so brutal. I couldn't even tell her the truth before she died. That's what haunts me most, that she never knew why I was so absent so often, why there were nights I couldn't be by her side. She died thinking I prioritized my work over her, never knowing that work was trying to make the world better for her, for Tom. Tom won't speak to me. He's 16 and angry at everything, but mostly at me. He thinks I didn't love his mother enough, that I wasn't there enough. How can I explain? This secret has become a wall between us, and I don't know how to tear it down without putting him at risk. Tears stung Tom's eyes. All those years of anger, of believing his father hadn't cared enough about his mother to be present during her illness. And all along, he'd been carrying this impossible secret, torn between family and duty. The last journal from 1989 held the answers to why the room had been sealed. November 9th, 1989. The Berlin Wall is coming down. I watched it on television with Tom, though he was barely paying attention, lost in his own teenage world. If he only knew what this meant, how many people like me had worked in shadows for decades to help bring about this moment. December 18th, 1989. Close call today. Agent K believes my last transmission may have been intercepted. We can't be certain, but protocol demands we shut down the operation. After nearly 20 years, my work is done. The equipment stays in place in case it's ever needed again, but the room will be sealed. The agency has arranged for a carpenter to renovate the study, installing the hidden door and lock system. When it's done, no one will know the room exists. I find myself both relieved and lost. Who am I without this mission that has defined so much of my adult life? Just a history teacher, just a widower with a son who can't wait to leave home. The world is changing, the Cold War thawing, but too late for me to rebuild what it cost me. Tom closed the journal, overwhelmed. The final entry had been dated just weeks before the room was sealed. His father had lived another 35 years after that, carrying these secrets alone, never speaking of the work he'd done or the sacrifice it had demanded, the radio equipment, the maps, the files. They were artifacts from a different era, preserved like a time capsule, but for Tom they were something else entirely. A window into the father he'd never truly known, the man behind the quiet, reserved exterior he'd resented for so long. In the corner, a stack of newspapers caught Tom's attention. He hadn't noticed them the night before. They were yellowed with age, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. The headlines told of Soviet political shifts, Eastern European uprisings, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Historical moments his father had played some small but real part in shaping, events he'd taught about in his classroom without ever revealing. His personal connection. Next to the newspapers was a cardboard box, containing what appeared to be personal items from sources his father had handled, small gifts, handwritten notes of gratitude, a few photographs of people Tom didn't recognize, lives his father had touched, perhaps even saved, that Tom had known nothing about. As noon approached, Tom reluctantly left the secret room to call and reschedule with the real estate agent. He wasn't ready to sell this house, not yet. Not until he understood the full story of what had happened within these walls, and not until he'd made peace with the father he was only now beginning to know. "I need more time," he told the agent. "Family matters to sort through." It wasn't a lie. For the first time in decades, Tom felt a genuine connection to his family, to the complicated, dedicated man his father had been, to the mother who had borne her own burden of secrets and silences. The house wasn't just a piece of property to be sold. It was the container of a history he was only starting to uncover. That afternoon, Tom returned to the secret room with a new purpose. If his father had documented his work so carefully, There might be clues about people who knew the truth, colleagues or handlers who could fill in the gaps. The journals mentioned first names and code names, but rarely full identities. Still, it was somewhere to start. In a folder marked 1987, Tom found what he was looking for: a photograph of his father standing next to another man, both in casual clothes but with serious expressions. On the back, in his father's handwriting, with Peter D. Chicago after the Bucharest situation, a name, a city. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Tomorrow Tom would begin searching for this Peter D. from Chicago, this person who might have known his father's secret life, who might be able to tell Tom the complete story of the quiet hero who had raised him, and whom he had never truly known until now. Finding Peter D. from Chicago turned out to be harder than Tom had expected. The internet gave him dozens of possibilities, none of which seemed connected to government work or his father. After 2 days of searching from his laptop at the kitchen table, surrounded by journals and notes from the secret room, Tom realized he needed a different approach. His father's address book, a worn leather volume found in the bedside drawer, contained mostly names of fellow teachers and distant relatives, but tucked in the back pages, written in the same faded blue ink as the note with the brass key, was an entry that caught Tom's eye. P. Donovan, emergency only, followed by a phone number with a Chicago area code. Tom stared at the number, his coffee growing cold beside him. What counted as an emergency now? His father was dead, the Cold War long over. But Tom needed answers, and this Peter Donovan might be his only link to his father's hidden past. With a deep breath, Tom dialed the number, half expecting it to be disconnected after all these years. To his surprise, it rang. "Donovan Residence," answered a gruff voice. Tom hesitated. "I'm looking for Peter Donovan. My name is Tom Fuller, William Fuller's son." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Tom thought the man might have hung up. Then, "Bill Fuller's boy? The history teacher?" "Yes," Tom said, his heart pounding. "My father passed away last week, and I found something in his house, a room, with radio equipment." Another long pause. "You're calling from a cell phone, son. Not secure. Where are you?" "At my father's house in Pennsylvania." "Stay there. I'll come to you." 2 days. The line went dead. Tom spent those 2 days continuing to sift through the materials in the secret room, piecing together fragments of his father's covert life. The more he read, the more he realized how little he had known the man who raised him. The journals painted a picture of someone deeply committed to his secret work, someone who believed he was making a meaningful difference in a divided world, even as that work cost him his relationship with his son. On the second day, a knock at the door made Tom jump. Through the peephole, he saw an older man with silver hair, wearing a worn leather jacket despite the warm spring weather. "Peter Donovan?" Tom asked through the door. "The same." "You gonna let me in, son?" Tom opened the door. The man who stepped inside was tall and lean, with the erect posture of someone with military training. He looked to be in his 70s, but moved with the deliberate efficiency of someone much younger. His eyes, pale blue and sharp, surveyed the hallway with a quick, assessing glance before settling on Tom's face. "You look like him," Donovan said. "Same eyes. Same way of standing, like you're ready to argue with whatever I'm about to say." Despite himself, Tom smiled. It was exactly what his father used to tell him. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Donovan. Peter, please." And I wouldn't have missed it. "Your father was one of the good ones." He glanced around. "So you found his operation room?" Tom nodded. "I was measuring for the real estate agent and noticed a discrepancy in the dimensions. Then I found a key, the brass one, behind the family photo." "You knew about that?" Peter smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "I helped him set it up. Standard protocol. Always have a way for authorized personnel to access the equipment if something happened to the operator. Your father insisted that the authorized personnel should include you when the time was right. Though I don't think either of us expected it would be 35 years later." Tom led Peter upstairs to the hidden room, watching as the older man ran his hand along the wall panels, nodding appreciatively at the craftsmanship of the concealed door. Inside the room, Peter moved directly to the radio equipment, checking dials and connections with practiced hands. "Still in perfect condition," he murmured. "Your father always was meticulous about maintenance." "Who exactly are you, Peter?" "And who was my father, really?" Peter settled into the desk chair, gesturing for Tom to sit on the cot. The official answer is that I was a regional coordinator for civilian intelligence assets during the Cold War. The unofficial answer is that I recruited your father, trained him, and served as his handler for nearly 20 years. He looked around the room with something like nostalgia. This was one of our best listening posts. Perfect location, excellent cover, and your father, well, Bill had a gift for this work. My father was a spy? Tom still couldn't quite wrap his mind around it. Peter chuckled. Not in the James Bond sense. He was what we called a signals man. He monitored radio frequencies used by our sources behind the Iron Curtain, relayed messages, verified information. Sometimes he helped arrange extraction for defectors. He never went into the field himself, that wasn't his role. But the work he did here in this room helped dozens of people escape from oppressive regimes and provided intelligence that proved crucial during some very tense moments in the Cold War. Tom thought of the quiet, reserved man who had taught history to generations of high school students, who had eaten dinner at 6:30 every night, who had seemed so utterly predictable. I never suspected anything. That was the point, Peter said. The best operators are the ones nobody would ever suspect. Your father's cover was perfect. A widowed high school teacher raising a son alone, living a quiet life in a small town. Who would imagine he was also running a sophisticated intelligence operation from his attic? Did my mother know? Tom asked, the question that had been gnawing at him since he'd found the first journal. Peter's expression softened. Yes, she knew. Helen was brought into the circle of trust early on. She had family in Hungary, which was part of why Bill was so motivated to help. She supported his work completely. He paused, weighing his next words. When she got sick, that was the only time your father considered walking away from his responsibilities. But she wouldn't let him. She told him, and I quote, "You don't get to quit making the world better just because my part of it is ending." Tom blinked back sudden tears. That sounded exactly like the mother he remembered. Practical, determined, always thinking of others. After she died, Peter continued, the work became Bill's anchor. I think it was the only thing that kept him going some days. That, and you, though I know things between you were difficult. I thought he didn't care. Tom said quietly, I thought he buried himself in his teaching because it was easier than dealing with me, with us, with the loss of my mom. Peter shook his head. He cared too much, if anything. He was terrified that his work might somehow put you at risk. The more tense things got internationally, the more he pulled back from his personal life. It was his way of creating a firewall between his two worlds. Over the next few hours, Peter filled in the gaps in Tom's understanding, sharing stories about operations his father had been involved in, helping a family escape East Berlin in 1978, providing crucial intelligence during the Polish Solidarity movement, monitoring Soviet communications during particularly tense moments of the Cold War. What about Sparrow? Tom asked, remembering the code name from the unfinished letter. Who was that? Peter's expression grew serious. Sparrow was your father's most important source. A high-level official in the Czech government who provided information for over a decade. His real name was Joseph Novak. Brilliant man, remarkable courage. Did my father ever meet him in person? Once, Peter said. In 1985. We arranged a meeting in Vienna during an educational conference your father was legitimately attending. They spent 6 hours together, mostly talking about books and music, their shared passions. Professional tradecraft discouraged personal connections with sources, but those two, they became something like friends despite never seeing each other's faces until that day. Is he still alive, this Joseph Novak? Last I heard, yes. After the fall of the Soviet bloc, he became a professor at the University of Chicago. History, like your father. Peter smiled at the coincidence. I lost touch with him years ago, but he can't be that hard to find. Tom felt a surge of excitement. Someone else who knew my father's secret life. Someone who might have a different perspective. Peter nodded, understanding. Finding Joseph might help you complete the picture. But Tom, he leaned forward, his expression earnest. What you need to understand is that your father lived a compartmentalized life out of necessity, not because of any flaw in his character. The distance you felt wasn't because he didn't love you. It was the burden of the secrets he carried, and the constant fear that his work might somehow blow back on his family. Tom thought of the journal entries, of his father's anguish over the walls between them. I'm starting to understand that, he said quietly. As evening approached, Peter rose to leave, pausing at the door of the secret room. "What will you do with all this?" he asked, gesturing at the equipment, the files, the physical evidence of William Fuller's double life. Tom looked around at the room that had changed his entire understanding of his father. "I'm not sure yet, but I think I need to find Joseph Novak. I need to know the whole story before I can decide." Peter nodded approvingly. "Your father always said you were stubborn like him, never satisfied until you had all the facts." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. "My real number. Call me when you're ready to take the next step. Some of these files might need to be handled carefully." After Peter left, Tom returned to the secret room and sat at the desk where his father had worked for so many years, monitoring frequencies, sending coded messages, quietly doing his part in a global conflict most people only read about in newspapers. The room felt different now, less mysterious but no less remarkable. On the desk, Tom placed the brass key that had started his journey, next to a photo of his father he'd found in one of the journals. A younger version of the man he'd known, standing beside a radio setup similar to the one in this room, smiling slightly at the camera. "I'm sorry, Dad," Tom whispered to the empty room. "I'm sorry I didn't know. I'm sorry I didn't try harder to understand." Tomorrow he would begin searching for Joseph Novak, the man codenamed Sparrow, his father's source and unlikely friend. Tomorrow he would take another step toward understanding the complete truth about William Fuller. History teacher, widower, father, and silent warrior in a shadow war that had helped shape the modern world. The University of Chicago campus sprawled before Tom as he checked the address on his phone again. Finding Joseph Novak had been surprisingly simple. A quick online search had revealed a professor emeritus of Eastern European history who'd published several books on Cold War politics. The university website even had his office hours listed, though it noted he only came in 2 days a week since his retirement 5 years ago. Tom had called ahead, leaving a message with a department secretary. He hadn't mentioned his father, just said he was researching Cold War civilian intelligence operations and had been given Novak's name as a potential source. It was close enough to the truth. The history building was an imposing stone structure with ivy climbing its walls. Inside, the hallways were hushed, the wood-paneled walls lined with glass cases displaying artifacts and photographs. Tom followed the room numbers until he found 317. The door opened a crack. A small brass nameplate read, "Dr. Joseph Novak." Professor Emeritus Tom knocked gently. "Come in," called a voice from inside, the words shaped by a slight accent. The office was smaller than Tom had expected, every available surface covered with books, papers, and framed photographs. Behind a cluttered desk sat an elderly man with a shock of white hair and round glasses perched on his nose. He looked up as Tom entered, his blue eyes sharp and alert despite his age. "Professor Novak? I'm Tom Fuller. I called earlier this week." The old man's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes at the name. "Fuller? You are researching Cold War intelligence operations, yes? Please sit." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Tom sat, suddenly uncertain how to begin. He'd rehearsed this conversation on the flight to Chicago, but now that he was here, the words seemed inadequate. "Thank you for seeing me. I'm not actually a researcher. I'm here because," he took a deep breath, "my father was William Fuller. I believe you knew him as Blackbird." Joseph Novak went very still, his gaze intensifying as he studied Tom's face. Then slowly, deliberately, he stood and walked to the door, closing it with a soft click. He returned to his desk, opened a drawer, and removed a small device that he placed on the desktop and switched on. It emitted a low, barely audible hum. "Old habits," he explained with a small smile. "Even now I prefer conversations like this to remain private." "You were Sparrow," Tom said. It wasn't a question. Novak nodded. "And you are William's son. I see him in your face." He leaned back in his chair. "How is he?" "It has been many years since we last spoke. He died 2 weeks ago. Parkinson's." Grief washed across the old man's face, genuine and deep. "I am very sorry to hear this. Your father was a good man, one of the best I have known." "That's why I'm here," Tom said. "I only just found out about his other life. I found a hidden room in his house with radio equipment and journals. I've spoken with Peter Donovan, but I'm trying to understand who my father really was. You knew a side of him that I never did." Joseph was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant with memory. Then he opened another drawer and pulled out a bottle of amber liquid and 2 small glasses. "Check Slivovis," he said, pouring a measure into each glass. "Your father and I shared this when we met in Vienna. The only time we ever sat face to face." He pushed one glass toward Tom. A toast to William Fuller, a man who helped change history from his attic. They drank, the plum brandy burning Tom's throat. "How did you meet my father?" Tom asked, setting down his glass. Joseph settled into his chair. "It was 1976. I was a mid-level bureaucrat in the Czech Cultural Ministry, but secretly I was part of a dissident intellectual circle. We were being watched, our meetings infiltrated. Friends began to disappear." His voice remained calm, but his hands tightened slightly on the armrests. "I had information, documents showing plans for a broader crackdown on dissidents across Eastern Europe. I needed to get this information to the West, but I had no contacts, no way out." He took another small sip of Slivovitz. "A friend of a friend gave me a radio frequency and a time. Said if I truly wanted to help, I should broadcast on this frequency at exactly 2:17 a.m. on the 3rd Tuesday of the month, a precise time to avoid detection." Joseph smiled faintly. "I thought it was most likely a trap. But I was desperate, so I took the risk." "And my father was listening," Tom said. "Yes, your father was listening. The first words I heard from him were, 'This is Blackbird. Identify yourself and speak quickly.' I had prepared a code name, Sparrow, and delivered my message in less than 90 seconds. Joseph's eyes grew distant with memory. 2 weeks later, the documents I had mentioned were on the desk of the U.S. Secretary of State. The planned crackdown was exposed in Western media and had to be postponed. Several of my friends were spared, at least temporarily." "That was the beginning of your relationship?" Joseph nodded. "For 12 years, your father was my lifeline. We established a schedule of broadcasts, created our own codes. I passed information that helped expose human rights abuses, warned of Soviet military movements, identified other potential sources who wanted to help. Your father never failed me, not once in 12 years. He was always there, always listening, always ready to receive whatever information I had risked my life to gather." Tom tried to reconcile this image with the quiet father he'd known. The man who'd checked his homework, who'd taught him to change a tire, who'd sat silently at his mother's funeral. Were there others? Other sources like you? "Many," Joseph confirmed. "Your father ran what we called a listening post, one of the most reliable in the network. Sources from Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, East Germany, all passing information that helped create pressure for change from the outside. Small pieces in a very large puzzle, but important ones." "He never told me," Tom said quietly. "Any of it." Joseph's expression softened. "He couldn't, of course. Operational security was paramount. But also," he hesitated, "your father spoke of you often in our brief exchanges. He worried that his work put you at risk. Keeping you separate from that world was his way of protecting you." "Did you meet my mother when you met my father in Vienna?" Joseph shook his head. "No, but he showed me a photograph. He said she was his strength, that her family's experiences in Hungary had inspired his commitment to our work." The old professor smiled gently. "He also said you had her stubbornness and his curiosity, a dangerous combination." Tom laughed despite himself. It sounded exactly like something his father would say. Over the next hour, Joseph shared stories about their covert communications, the coded messages they'd exchanged, the small victories and near misses over 12 years of secret collaboration. He spoke of the fall of the Berlin Wall, of how he'd wept when he watched it on television, knowing that people like Tom's father had helped make it possible. "After 1989, when I defected, your father helped arrange my position here at the university," Joseph said. "We met one last time in 1991, officially a meeting between a history teacher and a Czech academic. We both knew it would be the final time. The world was changing, our work was done." He smiled sadly. "We remained in Christmas card contact for perhaps 10 years, then lost touch. I always meant to reach out again, but time slips away so quickly." As afternoon light slanted through the office windows, Joseph opened a filing cabinet and removed a thin folder. "I have kept these all these years," he said, pushing the folder across the desk. "Perhaps they belong with you now?" Inside were half a dozen encrypted messages, carefully preserved with handwritten translations beneath each one. "Messages from Blackbird to Sparrow," From Tom's father to the man sitting across from him. Words of encouragement, warnings, operational instructions, and occasionally, brief personal notes. The last one, dated November 1989, read simply, "The wall is falling. You helped build the pressure that made this possible. Your courage has not been wasted." B. Tom looked up from the papers, his vision blurring slightly. "Thank you for showing me these." "Take them," Joseph insisted. "They are part of your father's legacy and yours." As Tom prepared to leave, Joseph walked him to the door, then hesitated. "There is one more thing you should know," he said. "Those exchange students who stayed with your family in the 1980s, the 3 teenagers from Eastern Europe." "I remember them," Tom said, surprised. "Dad hosted them through some educational program. Each stayed for a semester." Joseph shook his head, smiling slightly. "Not exchange students. Those were children of dissidents, sent out for their safety during particularly dangerous periods. Your home was a way station, part of what we called the paper bridge, helping vulnerable people reach the West. Your father never told you?" "No," Tom said, a fresh wave of amazement washing over him. "Never." "This is why we called men like your father heroes," Joseph said, resting a hand briefly on Tom's shoulder. "Not for grand gestures, but for opening their homes, risking their safety, and keeping others' secrets even from those they loved most." 2 days later, Tom stood again in the hidden room of his childhood home, seeing it with new eyes. Not just a secret space, but a small outpost in a global struggle, a place where his ordinary father had done extraordinary things. The real estate agent had called twice, anxious to schedule a viewing. Tom had finally returned her call that morning with his decision. "I'm not selling after all," he'd told her. "I'm moving back in." The house needed work, new plumbing, updated wiring, a roof repair. But those were just details. What mattered was that Tom finally understood why this place had meant so much to his father, why he'd never been able to let it go. Tom ran his hand along the radio equipment, the books, the maps, all these pieces of his father's other life. He wouldn't seal the room again. Instead, he'd preserve it, honor it, learn from it. Perhaps someday he'd find the right way to share this story, to let others know about the quiet heroes who had worked in shadows. For now, it was enough to sit at his father's desk in this room where history had been shaped in small but significant ways, and whisper the words he wished he'd said while his father was alive. "I understand now, and I'm proud to be your son." Outside, spring sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the yard where he'd played as a child, oblivious to the important work happening just above his head. Tom smiled, feeling his father's presence in every corner of this house that had held so many secrets, and now finally held the truth.